And there are other indicators. If you look at specific demographic groups like young Afro-Americans, the unemployment rate is close to 1 out of 2. Well, the only thing that makes us feel good is that Europe looks worse. There is continuing high unemployment, large budgetary deficits, and of most concern, the speculative attacks. Attack on Greece, potentially other European countries, and I'm sure in the question period we'll want to come back to this issue. Let me say very clearly, from my own perspective, I don't think that there's any real foundation for these speculative attacks. The European countries can meet their debt obligations so long as interest rates remain at a reasonable level. Greece's debt to GDP ratio is under 120%, much less than Japan's debt to GDP ratio. If interest rates are low, it will be easy for it to meet it. Obviously, if interest rates go up to 10%, that's a real problem. And that, of course, is what the speculative attacks are about. I think Europe responded, but much too slowly and still, in many ways, inadequately. There was effectively so far no institutional change. The problem was recognized at the foundation of the euro. Bob Mundell, my colleague at Columbia, wrote a famous paper for which he got the Nobel Prize that laid out what were the conditions that were necessary to have a common currency. The United States has a common currency. But among the problem in creating a common currency is you take away the exchange rate mechanism of adjustment, you take away the interest rate mechanism for adjustment, and then the question is, what are you left with? In the United States, if we have a problem in California, we have a federal fiscal system that can pay for unemployment and some of the other expenses of California. It's not as good as I would like, but it still enables the California to survive. But in Europe, there was no fiscal framework. When the EU was established, they created solidarity funds for the new entrants, of which I gather this building may have been one of the beneficiaries of the solidarity funds. But they did not create solidarity funds for stability, for dealing with a situation such as the current one, when one part of Europe was attacked, had problems, and the rest of Europe was not as adversely affected. And so at the time the euro was created, many of us were very much worried. We said there'd be no problem as long as everything was going well, when there's an economic boom. But when you have a downturn, a crisis such as the current one, that would be when the euro would be tested. And euro is being tested, and the response is much weaker, I think, than it should have been, and much weaker than it will have to be. And unless there's a stronger response, I think there will be problems down the road. One of the problems is, one of the responses to the inadequate framework, institutional framework within Euro, is demands many parts of Europe for a cutback in budget spending or increases in taxes. We know what will happen if that occurs in many of the countries. The economic growth will be cut back, and the deficit reduction will be weaker, and the problems will get worse. And so, for me, the prospects, as I say, are worrisome. Just to look at, from the perspective of the fiscal balance for the OECD, that's the advanced industrial countries as a whole, what one sees in this chart is how the crisis has seriously impaired the fiscal position. 2009, the average deficit as a percentage of GDP across the region, across the advanced industrial countries, was a little greater than 8%. 2010, things are expected to get worse. 2011, a little bit better, but not enough better to make the problems go away. Now, as I look at the situation, let me again go back to the United States and talk about what I see as the problems facing the United States. Many of these are also problems in other parts of the world, but I want to focus on the United States, as I say, because if the United States doesn't have a good recovery, it's almost impossible for there to be a strong global recovery. And there are 7 reasons that I am pessimistic about the United States. I feel a little bad about being quite so pessimistic. When you're given after dinner talk, and this is, I guess, an after lunch talk, you're supposed to make people feel better to help the digestion. And I'm afraid that this is not going to help the digestion a great deal, but let me go ahead and describe why I think that one should be worried. The first is the one I already talked about, that there is a cutback in Europe and in the United States in the fiscal support, the budgetary support, the stimulus spending. Let me try to explain what the nature of the problem was, that particularly in the United States, the Obama administration brought in some of the same people who had caused the crisis in the first place, whose failure of regulation, whose deregulation philosophy led to the problems. They didn't want to admit that they had really made a big mistake. So they wanted to minimize the scale of the problem. So they said, okay, the private sector has had a problem, our banking system has a problem, we'll fix the banking system, the economy will recover, we'll need government spending in the short run, but as soon as the private sector recovers, we can let the federal spending, the government spending go down. Well, the problem is the private sector is not recovering as fast as they had hoped, but the government spending is going to be withdrawn. And that means, what I say is it's going to be taken out prematurely, and that will weaken the economy. This is related to a second problem, and that is the United States, as Spain and many other countries, are federal systems, where 1/3 of the spending in the United States of the government occurs at the state and local level. And the states and localities have balanced budget frameworks. They can't borrow for the most part. And that means when their revenues go down, they either have to cut back spending or raise taxes. And the states are in terrible shape, and the localities are in terrible shape, and things are getting worse. The states depend, for instance, on property taxes. Property values are down between 30% and 40%. That means tax revenues are falling. The shortfall is $200 billion a year. $400 billion over 2 years. That's half the size of the entire fiscal surplus, fiscal stimulus.